He was just a 14-year-old orphan who found a suitcase with millions in it. In an instant, his life changed. Restaurants, hotels, friends. But in the end, he realized that money can't buy what really matters. Check out how this story turned out. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you're from. The town at the edge of the state never paid much attention to boys like Ethan Miller. He was 14 years old, but he looked younger, smaller than most of the kids his age, with his thin frame and hollow cheeks that gave away the hunger he carried with him like a shadow. He slept in an abandoned workshop on the outskirts of town, a place that smelled of rust and oil and mildew, where the roof leaked in half a dozen places and the windows had long ago been shattered. It wasn't home, not in the way most people meant the word, but it was the only shelter he had, and so he clung to it. Nights there were cold and unkind, the darkness filled with the sound of rats scurrying through broken boxes and rain dripping steadily through holes in the roof. But it was better than sleeping on the street. Every morning Ethan set out toward the dump. The dump was his routine, his lifeline, the one place where survival felt possible. The air there was heavy with smoke from smoldering trash, and the stench was so strong most people couldn't stand to be near it. But for Ethan it was familiar, and inside those mountains of discarded things, he searched for scraps of food, bent metal he could sell, or even just a half-decent jacket someone had thrown away. Sometimes he came away with nothing but filth under his nails and new tears in his already shredded sneakers. But sometimes he found small treasures, a can of beans only slightly dented, a cracked toy he could trade with younger kids, a rusted watch that still ticked. He carried himself with a strange kind of quiet determination, though. There was no one in his life to tell him that things could get better, no family to sit him down and reassure him that tomorrow might be kinder. His parents had died when he was too young to remember them clearly, and the years in different foster homes had only taught him that nothing lasted and no one stayed. He had slipped through every net, and now he floated alone, untethered, except for the routine of surviving each day. But even in that emptiness, Ethan still dreamed. In the nights, curled up on a pile of old coats he had dragged into the workshop, he sometimes sketched pictures on scraps of cardboard or paper he pulled from the trash. He would draw houses with warm lights in every window, kitchens filled with food, families sitting together around tables. Sometimes he drew himself in those pictures, sometimes he didn't, because part of him doubted he would ever belong in them. On one gray afternoon, when the sky hung low and heavy and the wind carried the smell of rain, Ethan wandered deeper into the dump than usual. The mounds of broken furniture and shattered glass seemed endless, but something caught his eye, half buried beneath a pile of torn mattresses and splintered wood. It was a suitcase old, worn at the edges, its leather cracked and dull. The handle was nearly broken, and one of the latches hung loose. It looked as if it had been forgotten there for years. Curiosity stirred in him. He tugged it free from the heap, brushing off the grime with the sleeve of his too-big jacket. The suitcase felt heavier than he expected. For a moment he wondered if it was just filled with bricks, or maybe clothes that had absorbed water until they weighed more than they should. He crouched down, checked his surroundings with quick, suspicious glances. No one ever paid much attention to him here, but old instincts told him to be cautious. His fingers fumbled with the rusty latches, and then, with a groan of protest, the suitcase opened. What lay inside made his breath hitch and his heart hammer so loudly he thought it might burst from his chest. Stacks of money, real money, bundles of bills bound with faded paper straps, piled high and thick, more than he had ever seen in his entire life combined. For a moment he thought it was a trick. Maybe it was fake, some kind of prop left behind from a movie shoot or a prank gone wrong. But when he picked up a bundle and slipped out a single bill, the texture beneath his fingers told him it was real. The smell of ink and paper, sharp and undeniable, filled his nose. He stared at it as though it might dissolve if he blinked. Fear crashed over him next. If this suitcase had been left here, someone must have lost it, or worse, someone had hidden it. Money like this wasn't left behind without reason. If he kept it, would men come searching? Would the police? Would someone find him and demand it back? The thought sent a cold shiver through him. For a heartbeat, he imagined faceless figures in dark cars, waiting outside the dump, watching him. But then another feeling rose to the surface, stronger than fear. Hunger, not just for food, though his stomach gnawed at him with constant emptiness, but hunger for something more, for warmth, for safety, for a chance to live differently. The suitcase was heavy, but it was also possibility. Possibility of escaping the nights in the leaking workshop, of not scouring through trash every day, of finally being seen not as a stray, but as a boy. His hands trembled as he closed the suitcase again and hugged it to his chest. The weight nearly pulled him forward, but he managed to haul it with him as he stumbled back toward the edge of the dump. Every step felt dangerous, as though the world might suddenly notice what he was carrying and take it away. But no one did. He slipped back into the alleys, through the cracked fence near the workshop, and into the darkness of his little shelter. Inside, he placed the suitcase on the floor and sat beside it. The rain began outside, tapping against the roof in uneven rhythms. He pulled the broken blankets over his shoulders and leaned against the wall, eyes fixed on the suitcase as if it might vanish if he looked away. It didn't feel real yet. It felt like some cruel dream, a test, or a story that couldn't possibly belong to him. But the suitcase was still there, solid and silent, full of promise. Ethan pressed his hand against the lid and felt the rough leather under his palm. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to imagine that tomorrow might be different. He might wake up and not feel hunger. He might walk through town and not feel invisible. He might be someone else, someone who mattered. Sleep came to him slowly that night, his body still tense with fear and anticipation. But when his eyes finally closed, the last thought that lingered in his mind was that maybe, just maybe, his life had changed forever. When dawn crept over the broken windows of the workshop, Ethan awoke with the same sense of disbelief he had fallen asleep with. The suitcase sat in the corner, mute and heavy, and for a moment he wondered if his mind had conjured it out of desperation, if he would open it now and find nothing but rags or old papers. But when he lifted the lid again, the dull gray light struck bundles of bills, and the sight was enough to make his stomach twist with hunger and his chest swell with wonder. He had no plan, no idea how one was supposed to handle something like this. He only knew that he could not keep living the way he had. That morning he walked into town with a single bill in his pocket, his fists clenched around it as though someone might pry it from him if he relaxed. He had always walked past the diner on Main Street, the smell of frying bacon and fresh bread drifting out to him like cruel taunts. He had pressed his face to the glass once or twice as a child, until the manager chased him away. Now, for the first time, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed, and the sound felt like a proclamation. The waitress looked at him, and for once her eyes did not narrow with suspicion. His clothes were still old, but they were cleaner than they had been, and the money in his pocket gave him a strange kind of courage. He slid into a booth, and when she asked what he wanted, he ordered a burger and fries, his voice shaking. When the plate arrived, steaming and fragrant, Ethan stared at it as if it were sacred. He had stolen bites of food before, scraps tossed aside, but never something hot and whole and meant for him. The first bite nearly made his eyes water. Grease, salt, meat, bread. It was overwhelming, filling him not only with nourishment, but with a sense of belonging. He chewed slowly, afraid it would end too quickly, and by the time the plate was empty, he felt both heavier and lighter, as though he had been restored in ways more than physical. The days that followed became a blur of new experiences. He bought himself clean clothes from a second-hand store, jeans without holes, a jacket that still held warmth, and sneakers that did not threaten to come apart with each step. For the first time in years, he saw his reflection in a shop window and did not cringe. The face looking back at him was still gaunt, his hair still unkempt, but he no longer looked like a boy who had been discarded. He looked like someone who might belong. With the suitcase hidden carefully back in the workshop, he dared to spend more. He found a small, cheap motel on the edge of town and paid for a room. The woman behind the counter raised her eyebrows, but when the bills slid across the desk, her expression softened into the practiced smile of customer service. Ethan carried the key up to the room, and when he opened the door, he stopped in awe. The room was plain, Nothing more than a bed, a table, a lamp, and a bathroom. But to him it was a palace. He ran his hand across the bedspread, pressed the mattress, and laughed softly. That night he showered for the first time in weeks, standing under the hot spray until his skin turned pink, watching the dirt swirl away into the drain. He wrapped himself in a towel and lay down on the bed, sinking into softness that seemed unreal. Sleep came quickly, and when he woke, he thought for a moment he was in a dream. Emboldened, he began to test the limits of what money could buy. He went to the movie theater and bought a ticket without hesitation, sitting in the dark as colors and sounds filled the screen, feeling as if the world had cracked open to let him in. He bought sweets from a candy shop, sticky and bright, that melted on his tongue. He tried the rides at the fairgrounds, laughing as the wind whipped his face, holding a paper cup of soda like it was a prize. Each experience was new, dazzling, and addictive. He had lived so long with nothing that the abundance felt like a flood. It didn't take long for others to notice. The same kids who had mocked him for his ragged clothes and empty pockets now looked at him with curiosity. They saw the new shoes, the meals he could afford, the way he walked with a strange new confidence. They began to circle him, inviting him into their games, calling his name like he had always been part of them. For Ethan, who had known nothing but exclusion, the sudden acceptance was intoxicating. He laughed with them, shared food, even handed out money when they asked. It felt good for a while to be wanted. But in the quiet moments when the noise faded, he felt something gnawing at him. Their eyes did not light up when they saw him. Not really, they lit up when they saw what he could provide. The smiles disappeared when his pockets were empty. The invitations stopped if he did not pay for their treats. He began to notice the hollowness of it all, and though he tried to push the thought away, it lingered like a shadow. One evening, walking back from town with his arms full of bags, Ethan saw movement in an alley. A scruffy dog, ribs showing, tail tucked between its legs, watched him with wary eyes. Ethan stopped, crouched, and reached into one of the bags. He pulled out a sandwich and set it on the ground. The dog hesitated, then crept forward, snatched it, and devoured it with frantic hunger. Ethan smiled. When he started walking again, he heard soft paws behind him. The dog followed, keeping its distance at first, then drawing closer. By the time he reached the workshop, the dog was at his side. He named him Buddy without much thought, and the name stuck. Buddy was different from the others. He did not care about money or clothes or food beyond what kept him alive. He looked at Ethan with simple trust, with gratitude that asked for nothing more. The boy felt a warmth in his chest that no purchase had ever given him. When he scratched behind Buddy's ears and the dog wagged his tail, Ethan felt for the first time that he was not completely alone. Still, the pull of wealth was strong. Each day he reached for the suitcase, took more, spent more, lived more boldly. The hunger that had once been for survival had become hunger for experience, for proof that he existed beyond the shadows of alleys and dumps. Yet even as he soared through this strange new world, he could not shake the quiet knowledge that it was fragile, built on something that could not last. He fell asleep in the motel bed, Buddy curled up at his feet, wondering how long it would all continue, and whether when it ended, he would be left with anything at all. The weeks passed quickly, as if time itself had been reshaped by the weight of the suitcase. Ethan had lost count of the bills he had pulled from it, but he knew the stacks were lower now, the neat bundles not as tightly pressed against each other. At first he tried to ignore it, telling himself that there was still more than enough, that the money inside could not possibly run out. But the truth was harder than denial. Each meal in a restaurant, each trip to the movies, each new toy or pair of shoes for the kids who clung to him like flies, it all took its toll. The suitcase had once seemed endless, a bottomless well, but now he could see its bottom faintly emerging, and it terrified him. The others did not notice his fear. They only noticed the flow of things he provided. When he walked into town, children who had once turned their backs on him came running, asking what he would buy them today. Older boys nudged him, joking that he should pay for rides at the fair, for snacks, for soda. At first he complied, eager to maintain the fragile sense of belonging, but each dollar he spent began to feel like a piece of himself slipping away. He laughed less easily now, smiled more rarely, And even when he tried to join their fun, something in him felt absent. He began to spend nights awake, lying on the motel bed with Buddy at his feet, staring at the ceiling and listening to the distant hum of traffic. He thought of the dump, of the bitter smell of smoke and rot, of the hunger that had once been constant. He had escaped that life, but he could not escape himself. The reflection in the mirror was cleaner, dressed in better clothes, but it was still him, the boy who had been overlooked, the boy who had wanted to matter. And now he wondered if he mattered at all, or if he was simply a walking purse for those around him. The friends he had bought began to drift when the money grew scarcer. One afternoon, when he refused to pay for their games at the arcade, they left him standing alone outside, pretending they had other plans. He walked the streets with Buddy, the silence pressing heavier than the noise of their laughter had. For the first time since finding the suitcase, Ethan felt truly invisible again. Not because he was poor or dirty, but because the illusion had broken. They had never seen him, only the green paper he carried. One night he returned to the workshop instead of the motel. The room smelled the same as it always had, of rust and mildew, though now his senses were sharper, spoiled by the comforts he had tasted. He sat on the floor beside the suitcase, opening it once more, staring at the thinning bundles. His chest ached, not with hunger this time, but with a deeper, more insidious emptiness. This suitcase, which had seemed like salvation, had only given him new chains. Memories rose unbidden, sharp and piercing. He remembered the day he had shared food with the other children who lived like he once had, their eyes wide with gratitude, their small hands clutching bread as if it were treasure. He remembered Buddy's ribs showing when they first met, the desperate way the dog had eaten, and the way his tail had wagged afterward with unguarded trust. Those moments had filled him with something no amount of candy or new shoes ever could. They had filled him with meaning. Now, as he scratched Buddy behind the ears, Ethan realized how hollow the rest of it had been. He could not recall the taste of the steak he had once ordered at the fancy restaurant, but he remembered the warmth that spread through him when Buddy curled against his side in the alley. He could not remember the thrill of the rides after the adrenaline faded, but he remembered the look on a younger boy's face when he handed him a blanket on a freezing night. The truth settled over him with clarity. Happiness had never been in the suitcase. It had been in what he chose to do with it. He sat in silence, the night stretching around him, and let the thought grow. Perhaps the suitcase was not meant to save him. Perhaps it was meant to show him what truly mattered. He could keep chasing illusions until the last bill was gone, or he could decide, while there was still something left, to make it mean something. His pulse quickened at the thought. For the first time in weeks, he felt steady, not because of what he owned, but because of what he could give. Buddy stirred beside him, resting his head on Ethan's lap. The boy stroked his fur slowly, whispering words he did not need to say aloud. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow he would not spend another dollar on hollow laughter or fleeting distractions. Tomorrow he would walk to the places he had once known too well, the alleys and abandoned corners, the shadows where children like him still tried to survive, and he would not go empty-handed. The suitcase no longer seemed like a curse or a miracle. It was simply an opportunity. It was not infinite, but then again, maybe it did not need to be. He had been given more than he could ever have imagined, and now he had a choice. He could be consumed by it, or he could transform it. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the cracks in the workshop walls, Ethan leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. He was still afraid, still unsure of what would come, but there was a strange peace in him too. The boy who had once believed money could change everything had finally learned that what it revealed was far more important. He was ready to choose differently. Morning came gray and soft, and for the first time in weeks, Ethan did not wake with the urge to reach into the suitcase and pull out a handful of bills for himself. The decision he had made in the silence of the night held firm, and as he rose, stretching his thin arms and shaking off the cold, he felt a quiet certainty replace the gnawing emptiness that had lived inside him for so long. The suitcase was still there, its edges frayed, its weight diminished by his months of indulgence. Yet it no longer loomed over him with the power it once had. It was just a vessel, a box of paper that could either vanish into nothing or be turned into something greater. For the first time since he had opened it, Ethan felt that he understood what it was for. He stepped outside with Buddy at his side. The dog, though still scruffy, looked healthier now, his ribs no longer visible, his tail wagging with an ease that mirrored the boy's shifting heart. Ethan clutched a smaller bundle of bills than usual in his pocket, not for himself, but for those whose lives mirrored his own. He walked through streets he had once avoided, past alleys where children huddled together under thin blankets, past doorways where eyes peered out with the same hunger he had once carried. They watched him now, not as a stranger who had somehow climbed above them, but as one of their own, returning with something they could not expect from the world: kindness. He bought warm bread from the bakery, not one loaf but 10, and carried them in a paper bag through the neighborhood where forgotten children lingered. He handed them out one by one, watching small fingers grasp the food, watching faces light up with the same disbelief he had once felt biting into his first real meal at the diner. Each smile left a deeper mark on him than any of the games, rides, or clothes ever had. He went to the thrift shop and bought coats and blankets, staggering under the weight of his purchases, then spread them among the coldest corners of the town. The children, younger than him and older, wrapped themselves in warmth, their eyes wide with gratitude that had no condition. In their gazes he saw himself reflected, and for the first time he felt seen. Word of his actions began to spread, whispered at first among the other kids, then noticed by adults who passed through those streets. They had grown used to stepping over the figures in the alleys, used to ignoring the hollow faces. But here was a boy, just a boy, dragging bags of food and clothing, giving them away without a trace of hesitation. Some shook their heads in confusion, wondering where he had found the means. Others simply watched in silence, unable to reconcile what they saw with the stories they told themselves about children like him. Yet none could deny the quiet shift that followed in his wake. At night he no longer returned to the motel. He chose instead to stay with those who had nothing, handing out sandwiches or blankets before curling up on the ground beside them. Buddy pressed against his side. He felt the hardness of the pavement, the bite of the wind, but alongside it he felt something new: connection. The children did not look at him as a benefactor or a source of gifts, but as one of them, a boy who had not forgotten. He shared in their laughter, their quiet conversations, their fragile hope. He had become part of something larger than himself, something that money could never buy. Buddy remained constant through it all. Each morning the dog trusted beside him as he made his way through town, and each evening the animal rested his head on Ethan's lap, as if to remind him that loyalty did not come with a price tag. Ethan often thought of that first moment, when Buddy had followed him from the alley, ribs showing, eyes cautious. Now the dog's gaze was steady, filled with a trust that asked for nothing but gave everything in return. In Buddy's presence, Ethan found the clearest symbol of the truth he had uncovered. Love and belonging were never purchased, only given freely. The suitcase grew lighter still. Each day he took from it and turned its contents into food, warmth, and moments of comfort for others. Yet instead of dread, he felt relief with every bill that left his hands. The weight of greed, of illusion, had fallen away. He no longer counted what was left, no longer clung to the fear of it running out. He knew it would end, and when it did, he would not be poorer for it, or he had already received what no suitcase could ever hold. In time, people began to notice more openly. A shopkeeper left extra loaves in his bag without charging him. A woman who ran a clothing stall quietly slipped an extra blanket over his arm. These were not gifts to the money he carried, but gestures to the boy himself. Gestures to the heart they had begun to see. It startled him at first, this recognition, but he grew into it slowly, understanding that it was not wealth that commanded respect, but the courage to share what one had. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the streets in gold, Ethan found himself standing before the doors of the very orphanage where he had once lived, a place he had left behind with bitterness and fear. The building was the same, its paint peeling, its windows cracked. Children's voices drifted faintly from inside, thin and subdued. He stood there for a long moment, Buddy leaning against his leg, and then he pushed the door open. The faces that turned toward him were small and wary, the same looks he had once worn himself. He placed his bags on the floor, unpacking food, blankets, and warm clothes, and one by one the children approached. They did not ask questions. They simply took what he offered, their eyes filled with quiet awe. Ethan watched them, his throat tight, and felt a swell of something so deep it threatened to break him open. He was no longer just a boy with a suitcase. He was someone who could give. That night, as he left the orphanage with Buddy padding beside him, Ethan felt lighter than he ever had. The suitcase was nearly empty now, but he did not fear its emptiness. He had discovered something far greater than wealth. The world no longer looked at him as an invisible boy scavenging at the dump, nor as a fleeting curiosity with money to spare. The world began to see him as he truly was, a boy who had chosen kindness when he could have chosen indulgence, a boy who had discovered that the truest treasure lay not in what he owned, but in what he gave. Standing under the dim glow of a street lamp, Ethan tilted his face to the sky. The stars were faint above the city's haze, but he saw them anyway, distant and constant. A smile spread across his face, one not forced, not painted by the desire to belong, but genuine and free. He understood at last that the suitcase had not given him happiness. It had given him the chance to find it. Beside him, Buddy wagged his tail, pressing his head against Ethan's hand. The boy scratched his ears, his smile softening. Tomorrow would come, with or without the suitcase, and he was ready. Because he was no longer alone, no longer lost in hunger and despair. He had found something that could never be taken from him. The suitcase would be gone, but Ethan Miller would remain, stronger for what he had learned, richer for what he had given. And as he walked forward into the night, with Buddy at his side, and the faint sound of children's laughter echoing behind him, he knew that true wealth had nothing to do with the paper bills in that broken leather case. True wealth was in his heart, in the lives he had touched, and in the unshakable truth that happiness could never be bought. It could only be shared. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Watch our upcoming videos for more powerful stories and explore the others already on the channel. And please, share this video with your friends and family because some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.